The middle of the 14th century was a time of change across Europe. Kingdoms rose and fell, trade routes stretched from the Mediterranean to the Far East, and cities grew larger and more crowded than ever before. Yet beneath the bustle of merchants and the clash of knights, there lingered an unseen danger, one that would soon alter the course of human history forever. Between the years 1347 and 1351, the world faced one of the deadliest pandemics ever recorded, the Black Death. It was a catastrophe of such scale that entire towns were erased from the map. Fields lay untended, ships rotted in their harbors, and cities once filled with life became silent graveyards. Historians estimate that between 75 to 200 million people perished in just 4 years, nearly half the population of Europe. No war, no famine, no natural disaster had ever claimed so many lives in so little time. For those who lived through it, it must have seemed as though the end of the world had arrived. The Black Death was not only a human tragedy, but also a cultural and social earthquake. It reshaped economies, destroyed long-standing institutions, and forever altered the way people thought about life, death, and faith. The medieval world that existed before 1347 would never return. In its place emerged a society forever marked by the shadow of the plague. This was no ordinary disease. It arrived suddenly, spread with terrifying speed, and killed with horrifying symptoms. Victims suffered fever, vomiting, and the appearance of large black swellings, buboes, on their bodies. To most, it was as though death itself walked the streets, choosing its victims at random. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, young and old, no one was safe. The story of the Black Death begins not in Europe but thousands of miles away, in the heart of Asia. From the steppes and trade routes of the Mongol Empire, a microscopic killer would begin its long march westward, carried by merchants, soldiers, and unwitting travelers. It was invisible, unstoppable, and merciless. By the time it reached Europe's shores, it was already too late. As we journey through this history, we will uncover how the plague began, how it spread across continents, what it did to the people and cultures it touched, and how its legacy continues to shape our world even today. This is the story of the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, the plague that brought medieval Europe to its knees and changed the course of history forever. To understand the Black Death, we must travel back to the heart of Central Asia, long before the plague ever reached the shores of Europe. The disease that would later devastate half the continent had its roots in the vast landscapes of the Eurasian steppes. There, in the grasslands and mountain valleys, lived a host of small creatures, rodents such as marmots, gerbils, and above all, rats. Within their blood dwelled a deadly bacterium, Yersinia pestis. For centuries, this microscopic killer remained confined to the wild, cycling between rodents and the fleas that fed upon them. Occasionally, outbreaks would flare among local animal populations, but rarely did it cross into human communities in any devastating form. Yet, during the 14th century, the interconnectedness of the world would change everything. The Mongol conquests of the 1200s had bound together East and West in a network of roads and trade routes later known as the Silk Road. With merchants, armies, and caravans moving constantly across the continent, the plague found new opportunities to spread. Historians and scientists still debate the precise moment when the disease jumped into human populations. Some evidence points to China in the early 1330s, where records describe a mysterious pestilence killing vast numbers. From there, it may have traveled along caravan routes westward, reaching the trading cities of Central Asia. What is certain is that, by the 1340s, the plague had become an undeniable presence, sweeping through the Mongol Empire. One of the most infamous early accounts of the Black Death's arrival in the West occurred in 1346, during the Siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the shores of the Black Sea. The city was besieged by Mongol forces who themselves were stricken by the plague. According to later chroniclers, the Mongols, weakened by disease, resorted to a grim tactic, hurling the bodies of their dead soldiers over the city walls, using primitive catapults. Whether this was truly the first instance of biological warfare or simply legend remains debated, but the result was catastrophic. The defenders of Kaffa soon succumbed, and fleeing Genoese merchants carried the plague aboard their ships into the Mediterranean. From there, the disease would spread like wildfire. But even before it reached Europe, the plague had already left trails of devastation across Asia. Reports from the Middle East, Persia, and India tell of entire communities wiped out, with cities left nearly abandoned. Caravan routes, once filled with merchants, became haunted by silence as travelers avoided infected regions. The flow of goods slowed, but the plague could not be stopped. Hidden within the fur of rats, nestled inside the bellies of fleas, the bacterium continued its relentless journey westward. The biological mechanism of the plague was as deadly as it was simple. A flea would bite an infected rodent, ingesting blood filled with Yersinia pestis. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria multiplied, eventually blocking its digestive system. Starving, the flea would attempt to feed again, regurgitating infected blood into its next victim. If that victim was a rat, the cycle continued. If it was a human, the results were catastrophic. Once inside the human body, the bacteria spread rapidly through the lymphatic system, causing swelling, fever, and in most cases, a painful death within days. In the early 1340s, these invisible killers traveled faster than armies, faster than news itself. And as they moved westward, they were carried not only by land caravans, but also by the bustling trade networks of the Mediterranean. The very prosperity that had linked distant regions together now ensured that the plague could move further and faster than ever before. By the time European sailors sighted dark clouds on the horizon in 1347, the fate of the continent had already been sealed. The Black Death had begun its march, and nothing could stop it. It was the year 1347 when Europe's destiny changed forever. In the autumn of that year, a fleet of Genoese merchant ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina. The sailors on board carried not only goods from the east but also death itself. Many were already dying, their bodies covered with black swellings, their skin marked with dark blotches. Those who managed to step ashore carried with them a sickness unlike anything the people of Europe had ever seen. Within weeks, Messina was overwhelmed. Fear spread faster than the disease, and as the survivors fled, they carried the plague with them to every port their ships touched. From Sicily, the infection leapt quickly across the Mediterranean. By the end of 1347, the plague had reached Marseille, Genoa, and Venice, the lifelines of Europe's trade and commerce. Once these gateways were breached, the pestilence poured inland, moving along rivers, roads, and caravan routes. Wherever there was trade, wherever there was travel, the plague followed. By 1348, the Black Death was a rolling storm engulfing the continent. From Italy, it spread into France and the Iberian Peninsula. From the south of France, it pushed north into England, carried across the Channel by unwitting sailors. Within months, London was choking with the dead. In the east, the disease swept through the Balkans and into Central Europe, striking the kingdoms of Hungary, Poland, and beyond. No city, no village, no monastery was safe. In Paris, the university's scholars were summoned to explain the disaster. Their conclusion was not microbes, which no one yet knew existed, but rather the movement of the planets, a punishment from God, or corrupted air rising from the ground. Doctors prescribed useless remedies, bleeding, purging, or carrying posies of herbs to ward off bad air. None of it helped. Victims continued to die in staggering numbers. The speed of its spread shocked contemporaries. In a single year, vast swathes of Europe had been infected. Chroniclers struggled to capture the scale of the disaster. In Florence, the poet Giovanni Boccaccio described how fathers abandoned sons, wives left husbands, and entire households perished without burial. In London, corpses piled in churchyards until there was no more space, forcing the digging of vast communal pits. Priests and gravediggers, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, themselves fell victim to the disease. One of the cruelest aspects of the Black Death was the way it seemed to strike at random. The rich, who could afford to flee the cities, often carried the plague with them into the countryside. The poor, trapped in crowded streets and filthy homes, died in droves. Even monasteries and convents, places of prayer and refuge, were not spared. Some lost nearly all of their members, their chance of devotion replaced by silence. As 1348 turned to 1349, the plague reached its terrible peak. In England, perhaps half the population perished. In France and Italy, entire towns disappeared. Across Germany and Switzerland, panic gripped the people. Rumors spread as to the cause of the devastation. Was it poisoned wells? Was it the wrath of God? Was it the work of outsiders? These questions would lead to suspicion, violence, and terrible acts of persecution. By the time the Black Death had swept across Europe, it left behind a continent scarred and depopulated. From the bustling ports of the Mediterranean to the remote villages of Scandinavia, death had come to every door. And yet, the worst horrors were not merely in the numbers of the dead, but in the way the living were forced to endure the unendurable, the collapse of families, of communities, and of the very order of medieval life. The Black Death had arrived in Europe like a storm, and by 1351 it would recede, leaving devastation in its wake. But the years in between would be remembered not only for the staggering death toll, but for the atmosphere of fear, superstition, and despair that gripped all who survived. The Black Death was not only terrifying for its speed, but for the suffering it inflicted upon its victims. Accounts from the time describe symptoms so ghastly that they seem to defy the imagination. Within just a few days of infection, the body turned against itself. Fevers raged, chills racked the body, and victims were gripped with an overwhelming exhaustion. Soon, great swellings, known as buboes, emerged in the armpits, groin, or neck. These could swell to the size of an apple and were dark, painful, and often oozed pus and blood. From these swellings the disease took its name, the bubonic plague, but it did not stop there. In some cases the infection spread into the lungs, creating a pneumonic form of the plague that passed from person to person through the air itself. Victims coughed blood and died in a matter of days. In the most dreadful cases, the bacteria spread into the bloodstream, causing septicemic plague, a swift, near-instant death marked by blackened skin, giving rise to the chilling name, the Black Death. What made the plague so horrifying was its unpredictability. Some succumbed within 24 hours of the first symptoms. Others lingered for a week before their bodies finally gave way. The stench of death filled the air as carts laden with corpses rolled through the streets. Survivors described entire households perishing within a single week, with no one left even to bury the dead. In towns and villages, fear became the constant companion of the living. Families abandoned loved ones at the first sign of sickness. Parents left children, husbands fled from wives, and neighbors locked their doors to avoid contact. The bonds of kinship, community, and faith that had held medieval society together seemed to disintegrate under the weight of despair. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed medieval burial practices. Churchyards could no longer hold the bodies that poured in daily. In London, huge pits were dug, capable of holding thousands of corpses. Chroniclers described bodies stacked like layers of lasagna, one upon another, until the pits were filled and new ones had to be opened. The rituals of burial and mourning, so central to medieval religious life, were often abandoned in haste. Doctors, powerless and ignorant of the true cause, resorted to desperate measures. They wore long robes, gloves, and strange bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, hopping to ward off the miasma, or poisoned air, they believed carried the disease. They prescribed bloodletting, bathing in vinegar, or carrying talismans, but nothing slowed the pestilence. Even the most learned physicians fell victim, their knowledge useless against the invisible killer. For the ordinary people, explanations turned to the supernatural. Some believed the plague was punishment for sin, a divine scourge upon a wicked world. Processions of flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in penance, begging for God's mercy. Others turned to superstition, charms, potions, or prayers whispered at midnight. Yet no prayer seemed to halt the plague's relentless advance. Those who survived lived in constant terror. They saw the faces of neighbors turn dark with blotches, heard the rattling coughs of the dying, and smelled the stench of bodies rotting in the summer sun. To live through those years was to inhabit a world where death walked openly, claiming victims at random, and where hope itself seemed to wither. As the death toll mounted, medieval society sought explanations. Unable to understand microbes or disease transmission, people turned to the explanations their world provided: religion, astrology, and scapegoats. The idea that the Black Death was a punishment from God became widespread. Preachers warned that the sins of humanity had brought divine wrath upon the earth, and that only repentance could restore balance. This belief gave rise to the flagellants, bands of men who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in acts of penance. Their processions drew crowds, both fascinated and fearful, as they cried out for forgiveness. For a time they were welcomed, but eventually their presence only spread panic, and in some regions they were suppressed by church authorities who feared their extremism. Yet religious fervor was not the only response. Fear turned to suspicion, and suspicion to violence. Across Europe, rumors spread that outsiders were poisoning wells or spreading the disease deliberately. In many regions, Jewish communities became the target of these accusations. Pogroms broke out in cities from Germany to Spain. Thousands of Jews were massacred, burned alive, or driven from their homes, even though they too suffered from the plague. The violence revealed not only the desperation of the time, but also the deep prejudices that could be inflamed in moments of crisis. Astrological explanations also flourished. Scholars pointed to the conjunction of planets in 1345 as the cause of the deadly air. Others blamed earthquakes or volcanic eruptions for releasing poisoned vapors from the earth. Some communities lit great fires or filled the air with fragrant herbs, believing they could cleanse the atmosphere. For the Church, the Black Death was both a trial and a crisis. Priests and monks, often the first to attend the sick, died in great numbers. Entire monasteries were wiped out. With so many clergy gone, spiritual leadership faltered. For many survivors, faith was shaken. Some turned away from the Church, questioning how a merciful God could allow such suffering. Others clung more tightly, convinced that only prayer could save them. Thus, the plague did not simply kill. It fractured the very fabric of medieval belief and community. It deepened divisions, sowed distrust, and left survivors struggling to find meaning in a world consumed by death. The Black Death was not only a biological disaster but a social and economic one. With populations cut nearly in half, the very structure of medieval society began to unravel. Fields lay fallow as peasants died or fled. Crops rotted, livestock wandered untended, and food shortages followed in the wake of death. In cities, the workforce vanished. Craftsmen, merchants, and laborers perished, leaving industries crippled. With so few workers left, survivors suddenly found their labor in high demand. Peasants who once toiled under the yoke of feudal lords could now demand wages or leave for better opportunities. The rigid structure of medieval feudalism began to crack. The wealthy, though struck by death as well, sometimes found opportunity amid the chaos. With land suddenly available, nobles expanded their estates. Yet even they faced shortages of servants and workers, leading to desperate measures to maintain their way of life. Governments tried to intervene. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, forbidding workers from demanding more. But such laws were difficult to enforce in a world where scarcity of labor gave common people newfound power. The collapse of order was visible not only in economics but also in law and governance. Courts and councils ceased to function in many places. Officials fled or died, leaving towns leaderless. Banditry rose, and abandoned homes became haunts for thieves. For many survivors, the world seemed to have been turned upside down. The rich could become poor overnight, and peasants could rise in wealth and status simply by surviving. Thus, the Black Death was not merely a period of dying. It was a period of transformation, tearing apart the old order and setting the stage for revolutions yet to come. By 1351, the Black Death had begun to recede. Like a storm that had burned through everything in its path, it left behind silence and emptiness. Entire villages stood deserted, their fields overtaken by weeds. In some regions, survivors were so few that wolves roamed the countryside, unafraid of humans who no longer populated the land. The demographic collapse reshaped Europe. Population levels would not recover for over a century. With fewer mouths to feed, those who survived often found themselves with greater opportunities. Wages rose, land became available, and social mobility increased. The old feudal system weakened, paving the way for new economic and social structures. Culturally, the impact was just as profound. The ever-present reminder of death gave rise to new art and literature. The dance macabre, or dance of death, became a common motif, showing skeletons leading the living in a grim procession. Writers like Boccaccio and the Decameron captured the fear and absurdity of life in a plague-ridden world. Death had become a constant companion, shaping the imagination of an entire generation. Religiously, the plague left scars. Some emerged with renewed devotion, while others grew disillusioned with the Church's inability to stop the suffering. This fracture would echo in the centuries to come, eventually fueling reform movements that challenged the authority of Rome. In science and medicine, too, seeds of change were planted. Though medieval physicians had failed to stop the plague, the sheer scale of the disaster forced later generations to rethink health, hygiene, and the spread of disease. The foundations of modern epidemiology, though still centuries away, were laid in the memory of the Black Death. The Black Death was more than a moment in time. It was a turning point in history. It decimated populations, shattered economies, and reshaped the very fabric of society. Yet from the ashes of this catastrophe emerged the seeds of transformation. The weakening of feudalism, the rise of wage labor, and the new opportunities for common people all contributed to the gradual end of the medieval order. In art, literature, and religion, the constant reminder of death fostered both creativity and skepticism. And in the centuries that followed, the memory of the plague lingered, shaping responses to future outbreaks. It is no exaggeration to say that the Black Death helped create the modern world. By breaking down old systems and forcing adaptation, it accelerated changes that would eventually give rise to the Renaissance, and much later, the modern nation-state. Even today, echoes of the Black Death remain. The bacterium Yersinia pestis still exists in wild rodent populations, and outbreaks have occurred in later centuries, though never again on such a scale. The story of the plague serves as a reminder of humanity's vulnerability to disease and of the ways in which catastrophe can both destroy and transform. The years 1347 to 1351 were among the darkest in human history. Yet out of that darkness came a world forever changed. The Black Death was not simply an epidemic. It was a force of history, a shadow that stretched across generations, and a reminder that life, fragile as it is, can be upended in the blink of an eye.